Indigenous Rights, Chapter 23, From Hunters to Farmers. Indigenous farming on the prairies. After the loss of the buffalo, there was a push to encourage indigenous peoples to become farmers. Indian Affairs sent experts to teach, and certain provisions in the treaties provided certain supplies such as seeds, spades, plows, etc. Many think that indigenous people are not suited to farming on the prairies, that they are too nomadic and accustomed to hunting and trapping. This despite good evidence that there is a history of farming among indigenous and Métis peoples. Cui bono? Or to whose benefit? So Indian Affairs' original position was that what they did was for the benefit of the Indians. This position has obviously changed over time, though the idea that they had good intentions persists. Numbered treaties were positioned as signed to address the desperate situation that indigenous people found themselves in, with the death of the bison on the prairies, the death of their way of life. However, these treaties ultimately benefited the federal government. They were able to take control of vast areas of land for non-indigenous settlement. The Indian Act micromanaged numerous facets of life on the reserve, including agriculture. The issue is that many reserves were not located on land suitable for farming, and many promises for equipment and seeds supplies by the government, they failed to come to fruition. They also faced stiff competition from many new settlers flooding onto the prairies. Even with these issues, indigenous people still were able to see success in agriculture. Despite this success, the federal government continued to enact harmful policies. Some of these were the severalty. It basically meant that reserve land was divided into 40-acre plots, with the max plot for an individual at 160 acres. This prevented communal farming, and also allowed the government to sell extra land to non-indigenous people. There was also peasant farming. The experts that were sent to help the indigenous farmers, well, they helped by focusing them on using peasant techniques and no technology, putting them again a disadvantage. And then there was the pass and permit system. This system restricted movement of individuals and their ability to sell and purchase goods. It essentially made it very difficult for indigenous farmers to compete. The Greater Production Campaign occurred in the early 20th century after the First World War. With this, the government gave vast swaths of land to veterans. And this land, unfortunately, was indigenous. It became far more easy to alienate or take non-cultivated indigenous lands. While the act was scrapped in 1919 for non-indigenous farmers, it remained in place via the Indian Affairs and the Commissioner for Greater Production until 1924. The Commissioner for Greater Production had 3 planned goals. 1. Lease as much reserve land as possible to non-indigenous farmers. 2. Create government-run greater production farms on the reserve. And 3. Stimulate agricultural activity among reserve residents. The third goal of stimulating activity was consistently ignored. And even worse, the indigenous lands that were leased were not paid for. Equipment such as tractors were purchased with band monies, not for indigenous use, but for the greater production farms on reserve land, despite the excuse that these acts were wartime measures. They continued to occur well after the war. It is no wonder that there is a false perception of the lazy indigenous farmer. They were set up to fail. They lost everything from the bison to their very land. The government promised assistance, but rather took the opportunity to seize land for non-Indigenous farmers, along with the numerous policies in place that put First Nations farmers at a perpetual disadvantage under knowing and purposeful federal policies.